In January of 1777, an American officer died of fever on a British prison ship anchored off Brooklyn. He had been wounded and captured the previous August. George Washington was personally trying to negotiate his release. The exchange was on the table. The paperwork was in motion. He died before it could happen. His name was James Piper, and the records that tell his story are still sitting in the National Archives, waiting for someone to look. If you do genealogy long enough, you find ancestors who are mentioned in published reference books, and sometimes those reference books are wrong. This is one of those stories. Lieutenant Colonel James Piper of the Pennsylvania Line is listed in the Standard Revolutionary War Officer Registry. The entry says he died in September of 1776. That is incorrect. He lived another 4 months. We know this because a fellow prisoner kept a diary. Today, I want to walk you through how the documents actually fit together, because the real story is more dramatic than the published one. In March of 1776, the Pennsylvania Assembly raised a special unit. They called it the Pennsylvania State Rifle Regiment. Most people just called it Miles Regiment, after its commanding officer, Colonel Samuel Miles. These were not ordinary infantry. They were riflemen. They wore hunting shirts and moccasins. They carried long Pennsylvania rifles, accurate at 300 yards. The British called them shirtmen, and were genuinely afraid of them. The regiment had 2 battalions. The 1st Battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Piper. He was commissioned on the 13th of March, 1776. That summer, Washington needed every soldier he could get. The British were massing on Staten Island. So Miles' regiment marched north and joined the main Continental Army outside New York City. By the 12th of August, they were assigned to Lord Stirling's brigade. 2 weeks later, they would be fighting for their lives. The Battle of Long Island was fought on the 27th of August, 1776. It was the largest battle of the entire Revolutionary War. 40,000 troops, counting the Royal Navy. It was also a disaster for the Americans. General Howe outflanked the Continental Army through an undefended pass. Hessian troops swept down from the north. Miles's regiment was positioned on the far left of the American line, near Flatbush. They were cut off. Of the roughly 1,000 men in the regiment that morning, nearly 200 were killed, wounded, or captured. 3 of the regiment's senior officers went into British hands the same day. Colonel Samuel Miles, the commanding officer, Colonel Samuel Atlee of the Musketry Battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel James Piper of the 1st Battalion. Piper was wounded in the fighting. We do not know exactly where or how badly. What we know is that he was alive when the British took him, and he was sent to New York. The American prisoners taken at Long Island were held in 3 kinds of places. Some were locked in churches. The Middle Dutch Church on Nassau Street became a prison overnight. The pews were ripped out. The windows were bricked up. Hundreds of men were jammed inside. Others were sent to the sugar houses, converted warehouses with tiny windows and no heat, and many were sent to the prison ships. The first prison hulk was the Whitby. She was anchored in Wallabout Bay on the 20th of October, 1776, right across the East River from Manhattan, in what is now the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Conditions were beyond description. The British did not feed prisoners adequately. They did not provide medicine. Smallpox ran through the holds. So did typhus, which the soldiers called jail fever. Of the roughly 4,000 Americans captured around New York in 1776, historians estimate that more than half died in captivity. James Piper was one of them. This is the part of the story most descendants don't know. While Piper was in captivity, Washington was trying to get him out. On the 25th of November, 1776, Washington wrote a letter to Colonel Samuel Miles, who was also a prisoner, but on parole, meaning he had limited freedom to negotiate exchanges. Miles had passed along a proposal. The British were holding several civilian officials, including a man named Francis Dashwood, the secretary to the British Post Office. Miles suggested swapping Dashwood for Piper. Washington's reply is preserved in the Papers of George Washington, Revolutionary War Series, Volume 7. He told Miles he would readily comply with the exchange if General Howe agreed, but he flagged a problem. Under the prisoner cartel, military officers were supposed to be exchanged for officers of equal rank, not for civilians. Howe had bent that rule once before, swapping Lord Stirling for a civilian governor. Washington said if he was willing to do it again, there would be no objection. The negotiation moved forward. Dashwood was eventually exchanged, but the swap took until February of 1777. By then, Piper had been dead for 3 weeks. So how do we know exactly when Piper died? A fellow prisoner named Jabez Fitch kept a diary. Fitch was a lieutenant in the 17th Connecticut Regiment. He was captured at Long Island the same day as Piper, and every day for the next year and a half, he wrote down what was happening around him: the arrests, the deaths, the names, the dates. His diary was eventually published in 1954 by W. H. W. Sabine under the title The New York Diary of Lieutenant Jabez Fitch. On page 108, Fitch records the death of Lieutenant Colonel James Piper. The date he gives is the 30th of January, 1777. The cause is fever. Fitch knew him personally. They were prisoners together. This is eyewitness testimony from a man who watched it happen. That is why the published reference book is wrong. Heitman, writing in 1893, was working from incomplete returns. Fitch was actually there. This is the genealogy lesson hidden in this story. A primary source from someone present in the room will almost always beat a secondary source compiled a century later. Always check the witnesses. James Piper has no known grave. The men who died on the prison ships were buried along the shore of Wallabout Bay, in shallow trenches dug into the sand. For decades after the war, bones still washed up after storms. In 1808, a group of New Yorkers gathered what remains they could find and built a tomb. In 1908, those remains were moved to a permanent monument in Fort Greene Park, Brooklyn. It is called the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument. It honors the 11,500 Americans who died on those ships during the war. Piper is almost certainly among them, unnamed, uncounted in any specific way. But there, he was a lieutenant colonel of the Continental Army. He commanded a battalion of riflemen. He was wounded fighting for American independence. He was held for 5 months in conditions designed to kill him. And the commanding general of the Continental Army was personally trying to bring him home when he died. That is the story, and it sat in the archives for 250 years. If you have a Revolutionary War ancestor, the records to find their real story are out there. Founders Online is free. The Pennsylvania archives are digitized. Pension files are online through Fold 3 and the National Archives. Diaries like Fitch's are on Internet Archive. The published genealogies will get you started. The primary documents will tell you what actually happened. Thank you for watching. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe. I research one ancestor story every video, all from the original documents. I'll see you in the archives.
Follow Brick Walls and Buckeyes for genealogy, Ohio history, and the stories behind your ancestors.